everyone, it's Lisa here. In this two-part tutorial, we'll first explore all the brushes included in AquaReal 2. I'll go over their intended use and tips for getting the most out of them. Then we dive into painting a lovely ceramic jug where you'll get a feel for using the brushes in an actual painting. But before we get started, I recommend importing the tutorial swatches included in the download, which can be found in the guide and tutorial folder. You'll also find the tutorial document and painting formula file in the same folder. Go ahead and import those as well into your Procreate gallery. Just a quick note on the canvases included. These have been specifically designed to enhance the brushes and deliver that authentic watercolor look. The canvases in AquaReal 2 are more textured and produce a really lovely contrast look. But of course, feel free to use these new brushes with the original AquaReal canvases as well. Don't forget, you can adjust any of the layer effect's intensity by unlocking the group. Then use the slider to increase or decrease the effect, or turn the layer off entirely to create more of a subtle look. Okay, we're going to do a quick overview of the brushes. I just want to walk you through the intention of each brush. But of course, this is just a guide, and if you find different uses for them or you find a different workflow that I'm showing you here, please obviously feel free to use that instead. But this, I'm hoping that you're going to get an idea of why the brush was created and how you can actually use it in your work. The set includes a couple of sketch brushes, so these are perfect for your rough sketch, your final sketch, and then of course any detail you need to apply to your watercolor work. So I'm just going to quickly run through them. The soft sketcher is perfect for both rough sketching and final artwork, so it entirely depends on your particular taste. This is quite a soft brush, and I personally prefer something more toothy, but I just want to kind of give you an idea of how this one looks. Often what I do with this one is just turn down the opacity. I do that specifically if I'm doing like a rough sketch initially, like that. So I find that that really helps me just to lay down some rough line work before I get stuck into my final artwork. So my next favorite brush is Lisa's pencil. So this pretty much appears in all my latest sets, and I love this brush for all my artwork and all my line work because it's quite toothy, and I particularly love that look, and I find the way the brush behaves and the way it works suits me perfectly, and I also really like the pressure variation that it gives. So as you're working, and if you vary your pressure, it gives you a really nice authentic pencil look, and that's the kind of look that I like in my artwork. And then the next brush, this one is my favorite as well for creating rugged kind of line work here and there. It's something that I like to, let me just kind of delete this layer. I'll show you exactly. So what I like to do often is just here and there add some defining line work. So what I'm doing is I'm just varying my pressure as I work. So this is ideal if you don't want to have this perfect outline in your artwork, but you just want a hint here and there, some defining lines. So that works really great for that. And then finally, the detail water pencil. This is perfect for once you've done your painting and you want to come back and add detail to your final piece. This brush works really well for that. So I use it when I want to do things like somebody's eyelashes or strands in their hair, or detail on clothing, or if I want to accentuate folds in clothing and things like that. This brush really works nicely for that. So what you want to do for a little bit of bleed, you just want to apply quite a bit of pressure as you're working. So light pressure gives you a nice thin line, if I can just show you. And more pressure gives you a nice bleeded, is that a word? Kind of bleed effect as you're working. So that's really nice to create some interesting watercolor effect in detailed work. So now we're going to look at the painting brushes, and the first one is Universal Watercolor Brush. This is kind of like the workhorse of this collection. It's my go-to that I start with mostly with my work. If I want more of a translucent effect in my colors, or if I'm layering different colors, then I would start with a translucent watercolor brush. But if it's just kind of a standard area that I'm covering, the universal brush will pretty much cover all your needs. So if we just start with the roof, and as with all digital watercolor brushes, you want to aim to not lift your pencil. But if you do, it's not the end of the world, because you can easily just smudge that. And sometimes that overlap actually adds to the authentic look as well. And with this brush, there is a slight variation in pigment placement when you apply different pressure. So what I mean by that is, if I apply light pressure, there'll be more ink, and the more pressure I apply, it's like I'm adding more water, so the color will become slightly more translucent. So I'm applying light pressure, and as I apply more pressure, there is a slight variation in the translucency of this brush. And then moving on to the translucent brush, that effect that I discussed now with the pressure is more accentuated. So light pressure on this brush will give you more ink, and the more you push down, if you can imagine, the more water you're applying. So as you work, you might want to come back to smudge areas as you're working, or you want to vary the pressure to create different variations in ink placement. But as mentioned, this brush is fantastic for layering different colors. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's apply maybe a more of a purpley blue color. So I'm working on the same layer. I haven't created a new layer. And I'm just pushing down for more water. In other words, more translucence. And there we have a nice blended color between those two colors. So that brush is really great if you want to create more rich tones in your final piece. So moving on to the shadow brush, I'm just going to create a new layer above that, and I'm going to set that to multiply. And I'm going to stick to this cool purpley color. So the shadow brush was specifically intended for shadow work. So you'll find the brush has a nice sort of fall off, what they call a fall off. So it starts with quite a lot of ink, and it becomes more translucent as you work. So that can be really handy if you want to layer ink, if you want to kind of layer a watercolor pigment. So let's work on this corner here, and you can smudge as you go, which is quite nice with this brush. So I've just laid my first layer, and I'm going to come back because I want that area to be darker. And because it has a lovely fall off, it's going to smudge quite nicely with the original layer we've already laid. And you can keep going back and keep adding as much as you want, depending on how dark you want that particular area to be. And I'm going to show you on this area where there isn't any ink or pigment. So that's my first layer. And you'll see I'm kind of going back to smudge that dark area first. And then I'm coming back again. And I quite like those hard edges as they're drying, because that makes it look a lot more authentic. And it's very similar to how a natural watercolor would behave. Our next painting brush is the Rough and Patchy. So this is a wonderful brush for instant kind of blotchy, watery mark texture. It's a bit big. And this is super pressure sensitive, so it almost works the other way around to the other brushes. So the light pressure gives you translucence, and the more pressure you apply, the more ink you'll have. And it's also the kind of brush that works with smudging as you go. So if you don't like a particular area and it's looking a little too rough for your liking, you can go back and smudge that as you're working. I haven't lifted my pencil because I want to control that ink as I put it down. And I'll show you the same color, the same area, but just with one pressure. So I'm pushing quite hard, and the effect is a bit more uniform. So you can really control how much texture you want with this brush, and I'll show you what it looks like if I apply light pressure. So it's quite different depending on the pressure you apply with this brush, which really gives you a lot of control. So moving on to the smudge wash. This is another brush I use for shadow work as well, but it's also fantastic for smudging two colors together. It's also great for layering colors, and I'll show you exactly what I mean. It has a lovely fall off like the shadow brush, and it's far more translucent. And what's nice is that you can keep layering your colors as you work. And if I wanted to, for example, gosh, let's use that color. It really blends nicely. Oops, I keep undoing things. It really blends nicely together. And as I mentioned, you can intensify it by just simply layering your ink. So again, you can control the effect of it. And I'm just using circular motions to smudge those two colors together. And let's go really different to show you the effect. So this is a really great brush for layering different colors and blending them as you work. And it also has a nice big size, so if you did want a wash, for example, it works nicely for that too. Okay, so moving on to the clipping mask textures. These were designed to be used with clipping masks, but of course it's not set in stone. You are welcome to use them outside of clipping masks. I just find that often using it within a clipping mask, you can control the effect, and it's much easier to work with instead of having to erase certain areas. But having said that, the patchy water stain and the granulation and the splashes, for example, can very much easily be used outside of clipping masks, and I'm going to show you how to do that. So the first one is the hard edge texture. So this is great for really quick grungy texture that you can apply to a watercolor area. And I'm going to use it on the house part. So I'm creating a new layer above that, and I'm going to set that to multiply and turn that to a clipping mask, and choose, I'm going to start with this sepia brown color and see where that takes me. So this brush is kind of almost like a stamp. Well, it's unpredictable, so that's really nice about it. It starts creating its own kind of textures, and it almost feels natural in a way, because often we can't control watercolor, you know, in real life. So this is almost mimicking that, and it's really nice because, you know, each time you use it, it will give you different results. As I said, it's quite an unpredictable brush, which is really nice. And then of course you can you know, change the opacity. You can control that in your layers panel, and of course you can change the color and try different blend modes. So multiply and color burn are the two that I use the most. And as I said, this is quite a strong texture. It's got really nice, lovely hard edges, but you can easily blend those out if you want to soften them. So coming over to our smudge brush, and I'm just using one of the blenders, and if I want to blend, for example, just, you know, that area, I'm just going to just lightly blend that and kind of mush it in with my background a bit better if I find that edge too hard. But I quite like that effect. It kind of gives it building a old vintagey vibe, so I'm going to leave it like that. And then the next texture brush is it's really nice to use on edges of areas, and I'll show you what I mean. So what I like is it's got like a nice unpredictable bleed, and I like using it here and there just on the edges of things just to add some interest. So again, this is a brush that I would suggest using sparingly, otherwise it starts looking a bit contrived. And of course you can, you know, blend those edges if you're finding any of them too hard. And the next brush is the patchy water stain. So this is also great for, used as a clipping mask. Let's just do that actually. You'll see it'll give you an overall instant texture. Or what I like to do with this brush as well is use it as a, kind of like a wash. So I'm just going to move that underneath everything and use a much lighter color. So it's also a great instant wash and has that like kind of patchy look about it. And again, you can blend areas, you know, using any one of the blenders just to soften it if you're finding the patchwork a little bit too much. And then moving on to the granulation brush. So I like using it on top of other painted areas, and let's use it on the roof. So I'm going to use a similar color to the roof, and I'm making sure I'm setting that to multiply because I want it to blend with everything underneath. So I'm just going to move that to my roof, just above my roof. And oops, too big. And it gives an instant granulation effect that you can use without a clipping mask. So what I would do if I'm not going to use a clipping mask, I would just erase those areas, or for a far more subtle effect, you can clip it to your layer, and it just adds that extra kind of grungy, granular effect to that originally painted piece. And then of course you can use it on its own. And let's use that layer just to show you the brush without anything underneath. So it's really nice granular texture that behaves quite similar to a bleed brush, and you can push it out like you would you know, normal bleed to get those lovely bleeding edges. So that really will give you instant texture without too much effort. And then finally, the splash accents. So normally splashes are stamp brushes, but what I wanted to do was I didn't want to create yet another splashy stamp brush that we all seem to have already. So this brush is more like a paintbrush, and I'm just going to set that to multiply and choose a more subtle color. And the nice thing about this is that you can actually vary the size of those little splashes as you work. So the bigger the splash, the more I'm going to push down on pressure. So that's quite nice, and you can use it, you know, with short strokes, or you can use it continuously like I just did. It's entirely up to you, but what's nice, as I said, you can vary the size of these little splashes and dots by the amount of pressure that you use. And again, I would suggest using this sparingly, otherwise it starts looking a little too contrived. Okay, so we're going to move on to the blenders. And one of my favorite one is the water bloom. So this is a great way to create your own bespoke water seeps anywhere in your artwork instead of relying on a stamp, for example. And the best way to use it is to use it in its brush form, not as a smudger. And a light color is best for creating that effect. And you want to be working on the same layer as the actual ink or pigment that you've applied. And what you want to do is you're going to control the edges, the hard edges, by the amount of pressure that you push down. So I'm going to start at the corner here, and I'm just going to push the ink inwards. So the more pressure I apply, the darker the edges. If I lighten my pressure, you'll see the size of the edges diminishes. So you can really control how much darkness you want there. And if you like the effect to be more intense, you can just keep doing that if you want. And it'll push the ink out. So, if you want to give that effect that a water drop has dropped there, it depends on how much ink you want to actually remove. So you'll notice, obviously, I haven't used white, and due to there is a bit of smudge happening, you will start seeing areas like that. You might want to leave that, but if you don't want to leave that, you can simply come over to your eraser tool and just delete that. What I normally do is I use another smudge brush just to soften that line over there to make it look even more authentic. So coming over to my smudge, I either use the blender or all-rounder or the spidery water. So I want to give the impression that the ink is kind of doing that. That's why I'm using the spidery water. And I'm just kind of pulling the ink as I work. And you want to be experimenting with the size of the brush. And I'm also going to be pushing the white or the blank side of the canvas back as well, just so that it gives a nice even blend. And you'll see the more I push that white, the more it starts affecting the ink placement essentially. So you just want to be experimenting, see how far you want to push it. It's entirely up to you. And then another really fun blender is the spidery bleed one. So this you want to be pulling for if you want your pigment to look like it's running, as if you dropped some pigment onto your paper. So let's do that. Actually, what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this section here. So first I'm going to blend this out. And coming back to my water bloom. So it's now a brush, not the smudge. And I'm just going to kind of put my dollop of water there. I'm still on my spidery water, and I'm just blending that out. You can decide how much you want to, how much drift you want. And then I'm just going to use, so the water generally does this, it kind of goes in a fan shape, but not always. So what you want to do is you want to actually study what do bleeds look like in real life. Just have a quick look on Google just to see how those bleeds behave, just to make it a bit more authentic when you do pull these the pigment. You can even do little wiggles. Sometimes I find the water wiggles as it moves. And again, you want to be studying. Just have a quick look at what real bleeds do, how they behave, and you can decide how much of a pull you want. So that's a really nice way to create your own kind of water bleeding effect. And again, you can decide how much intense effect you want. If you just want it quite subtle, it's entirely up to you. And then of course, finally, we have a soft blender. So that's really nice if you want to blend really large areas together, especially if you want to mash two sort of colors together. I like using the soft blender initially, and then maybe the all-rounder. Just depends on the actual look you want to go for. I quite like the spidery look. And it's a nice way to mush two areas together. And again, just as a reminder, we are working on the actual layer of ink. So that's a really nice way to blend two colors together. And then finally, there are some lovely texture stamps. So the first 7 are great for background washes, or you can use them in clipping masks. And it's a really fun, quick way of adding a background without too much effort. So if I just choose, let's go with that one, and I've got it to its max. So I'm going underneath this little house, and we're just going to stamp once. That's quite large. And then just move that into position. And if I find, because watercolor is quite translucent, so your underneath is going to show through, and I don't really want that. So what we want to do is actually erase that. So you can decide if you want to use a watercolor eraser, or if you just want to go with a hard, you know, brush instead of a watercolor brush. And I'm just going to quickly, just to give you an idea. And if you're concerned that it's going to look too hard, you can always smudge those edges. Like for example there. Just coming over to a proper smudger. So that's a lovely quick way of adding a background wash. And then I like using these stamps for quick shadows. For example, maybe you want a shadow here of a building. Let's stamp that one out. I'm going to use a cool color, and I'm going to use it on my shadow layer. So I'm just going to stamp once. Actually, I'm going to use a different layer so I can manipulate it. So I'm setting that to multiply and stamping once. Now I can move that into position. Taking my snapping off, and you can decide where you want to place that. I think that looks pretty good. And of course, control the opacity, and again, smudge any edges that you don't like if you find them too hard for your liking. So let's smudge that a bit. So those are really great for quick authentic looking shadow work or markings, you know, in your final art piece. So I hope that's given you a good overview of the brushes. And now we can move on to applying that knowledge to an actual painting. Now that you have an overview of the brushes, we're going to dive into putting them to work by painting a lovely ceramic jug. But first I just want to show you the 2 files that are included with your download. So in the guide and tutorials folder, you'll find 2 Procreate documents. The one is the painting formula that just explains each of the layers that I use, generally speaking, in my painting process. And I've just included some notes. So what you can do is you can just work your way through each layer that describes my workflow, and I'm hoping that by including this information, it's going to make you feel less overwhelmed, especially when you are new to watercolor painting in Procreate. And you can just use this as your reference and come back to it if you need to. But I thought it would be a nice thing for you to see the actual layers and how each one works and the notes that go with those layers. And then the second file is the tutorial. So opening that up. So what I've done is I've included my sketch layer already so that we can dive straight into painting. And you'll see I've included this a jug painting as well in this document, and we're going to be using exactly the same layers, just that you can start getting a feel for how you can work, you know, neatly in layers and feel less overwhelmed. And what I want to do, the first thing I want to do is just turn that opacity down of the sketch layer. So I'm just going to bring that down to about 50. And what I personally like, and this is entirely up to you, and it's a preference, it's a design preference, I like leaving that final sketch layer in my artwork, and it kind of gives it, you know, sort of authentic look, as if I'd painted or drawn on paper, and then I didn't erase it, I just painted on top of it. But this is literally a personal preference. It's not something that you have to do. But I do generally bring down that opacity. So I used one of the sketch brushes. If I'm not mistaken, I used Lisa's pencil just to draw out that the jug, and just to basically plot where I want my watercolor to be. But again, you don't have to be as rough as I was. It's entirely up to you. It all comes down to your personal preference and style. And included in the download, you should see a color swatch as well called the AquaReal jug, and we'll be using these swatches to paint this jug. And again, that's entirely up to you if you want to follow along with these colors, or if you actually want to you know, create your own colors. Just want to delete that because that shouldn't be there. Okay, so just to briefly explain how I generally work when I'm working you know, with contrasting colors like this. So the lighter color needs to be fairly light, and you'll see the cream of the jug is actually quite light. It's almost white, and the reason why I do that is because I like using splotches on top of that. And if we're starting with a medium tone color, then, you know, if we're going to add splotches on top of that, the color is going to end up quite dark. So I would rather recommend that you start with a lighter color and then build on top of that. It's just much better to control that way than starting with a mid-tone and then you finally end up with too dark an area, you know, once you've added all your splotches and your textures and that kind of thing. So start with a light color as your base, and then you can work on top of that. So coming to our jug, because now we've already sketched our jug out. So coming to our paint layer and the cream, I'm starting with the cream. Whoops. And we're going to start with a universal watercolor brush. And you'll notice that the color is, as I said, quite cream and light. If you're struggling to see it, what you can do is turn off the background layer, and this will help you see light colors much easier when you're working. So what I'm aiming to do is finish my whole area with one stroke, but it's not essential. If you need to lift your pencil, go ahead and do that, because I don't want you to stress over trying to not lift your pencil. And then if you don't like, excuse me, if you don't like the overlap once you've lifted your pencil, you can just blend that area with one of the blending tools. So I've managed to do that in one stroke. And just a tip, I know it's obvious, but sometimes we forget. You want to make sure, if you need to do it all in one stroke, that you can see the entire area before you begin working. You don't want something cut off and then you need to move it. And then also find areas where you can take a break. Like, for example, the base of the jug is separate to the body of the jug. So that was an area that I decided to use as a break. And I'm just going to turn off that paper background and the effects, just so that I can see. In fact, let's just do that. I can see that better. So that's given me a better idea of where that cream's falling. And I just want to check my work. And you'll see over there we've missed a spot, so we can either do that, which I'm happy to do, or you can use your liquify tool if you just want to push ink to edges. And I don't mind the odd gap, because that all adds up to the, you know, the authentic sort of feel of the painting. And I think what I will do over here is just push that. So I'm on my push, and I'm just going to push that to the edge. And the reason why I'm doing that, because I want to retain that hard edge that this brush creates. It is subtle with this color, but it does all add up. And I'm just going to turn my paper effects back on. Okay, so I've laid down the cream, and the next thing we want to do is add some interesting splotches. So coming over to a darker color, I'm going to use this sort of medium tone and the hard edge texture, and this is where you can experiment with using stamps, or you can use the clipping mask texture. And I'm just going to go for subtle texture here and there, and this is just to add some color variation. And you'll see the lighting for the jug, there's some shadow happening here. So I'm kind of concentrating my texture to be on this side. And I think I'm pretty happy with that. What I might do is add just a bit of color variation. So I've come over to the smudge wash, and I'm still on that clipping mask. And I want to see what it looks like if I add just a little bit of a different tone. So this is a nice way to add variation to your color, so it doesn't all look sort of flat. And I'm just subtly adding it here and there. And you could, if you felt bold and brave enough, you could even do it on the actual layer of the jug. And if you want to keep it quite subtle, we could even go for a lighter color. And again, this is a personal preference. I'm just adding variation in color here and there. And I know the jug's going to be dark on the inside, so that's why I'm adding more ink over there. And I see this area here, I just want to push because I quite like that dark edge. So I don't want to smudge, and I'm just going to push. Oops, my brush is too big. So I'm pretty happy with that. I'm going to move on to the next phase, which is the handles and the trimming. So choosing the darker sort of bluey purpley color, coming back to my universal brush. I'm going to see how that is. What we want to do is we want to think about just leaving a little bit of a white gap over there, and maybe over there. So if you are working from real life, it's really it's actually a great way to study the subject, and you can see where the light is hitting the object and where your highlights are. If you, as I said, if you are using a real life object or from a photograph, definitely take advantage of that, because all those little subtleties add to the overall feel of your painting. So this is going to be tricky to do in one stroke. And also what I want to do is I want to leave a white gap and then blend it later. So I'm actually not too concerned about needing to lift my pencil. And our highlight is probably somewhere like that. And what I want to do is I want to get a little bit more ink over there. So coming to my smudge wash, Just bring that down. I've just lifted my pencil to keep applying more ink. And now I'm going to use the spidery water just to do some smudge work, making sure I'm on the right size. And I'm just going to blend those areas. And I don't mind if that starts happening, because that also can add to the overall authentic feel. You know, as your water starts seeping in over your page. So this area is going to be smudged quite a bit. And I'm going to move over to the all-rounder, which is a bit more of a smoother smudge tool. And I'm just pulling a little bit of that white and then pushing it back. So I'm playing around, pulling and pushing. I think that's looking quite good. As I said, I like that. You might want it a little bit neater, but I'm going to leave it like that. And now I'm going to move on to the rim. And coming back to our universal brush again. I'm just going as slow as I need to, just to maintain control. And I'm going to swap over to the translucent brush because I would like some highlight over here. So I don't want as much ink. And then again, do a little bit of smudging. So I'm using the spidery and coming right down. So definitely don't rush your line or your strokes. If you need to take your time, take your time. There's no rush. And then I just want to do kind of like a decorative line. But that doesn't look so nice. Okay, I think that's looking pretty good. So as with watercolor on paper, you're building up ink and you're building up sort of texture, and that's what we're doing, exactly the same process over here. So what I want to do now, though, I want to start creating some interesting bleeds, and we're going to use the water bleed brush and using the same color as the jug. And I'm still on the layer of the handle, so I'm on that same layer where the ink is, and I'm just going to test the size of this. I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so what we want to do is I'm just pushing some of that ink up a bit and creating some interesting water stains, because what I want to create is almost like a bleed effect into, as if the purple was wet when we applied it. Or should I say the jug was still wet when we applied the purple, so it kind of bleeds into that. So I'm on the spidery, and this is just instinct, no real set rules, so you're gonna have to just experiment a little bit. And what I do is, so I blend a bit with the spidery, and then I use that pulling seeping brush, the pull pigment brush, and we're just going to make our little legs that kind of seep into the jug. And again, you can, you can decide how intense you want that. You might want it super intense and a lot of bleeding. So I'm kind of curving that as I work. Oops. And I'm pushing back as well. So as you get used to these brushes, you know, the blending, how to use the blend in the best way that it suits your style, you'll know how much to pull and how much to push. It is just a matter of experimenting and getting used to it. So what I want to do now is just intensify that area. To me, it looks a little too, you know, it's not dark enough. Coming back to my original purple, I'm going to use the smudge wash, quite small, and I just want to add more pigment. We could have done it also with perhaps a clipping mask. I want to give the impression that there was a whole lot of ink that went there, and now it's kind of bleeding into the jug. Okay, so I think that's coming together quite nicely. And maybe what we're going to do is just over there, to make it a bit more believable, because if this area was wet, we probably had the same thing kind of happening there. So just maybe a little bit of bleed here and there. And just want to do it subtly, essentially making it less neat and a little bit more textured and rugged. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the flowers. So if we expand our pattern group, I'm just on the flower layer, and I'm going to use a lighter sort of bluey purple color for that. And I want to use the rough and patchy, so that just so you can get an idea of how this brush works and how you can have fun with the pressures and the various textures that it produces. Making sure it's the right size. So I'm varying my pressure as I work to create different results. So there was quite a bit of pressure, and now I'm sort of easing off. And I hope you can also notice how my speed of the way I'm working. Sometimes, you know, if it's a flat area, I know I can go quite fast, but if I want to control the ink and sort of the pressure of the brush, then I slow down. Okay, so now I'm going to work on our branches. And what I want to do is I want to play between the universal brush and the translucent brush, just to get some variation in the amount of paint that's going down. So let's start with our universal brush. Make sure it's the right size, a bit thick. So I usually paint my stems first, and then if I need to, I increase the size of the brush. And now I'm just varying my pressure as I paint my leaves. That wasn't very nice. too big. So we're just keeping this fairly simple by not adding you know, another layer of variation. We could have easily added splotches on top of this, you know, where all the stem work is, for some color variation, but I'm just going to keep it simple. That wasn't nice. And all I did was just, as I said, vary my pressure as I'm working. And I want to come over to the translucent brush. And there you'll see quite a lot of, you know, water happening in the middle. But I just want to blend that out a dash. So that gives us, you know, instant variation in color. And again, if you're finding your line work too neat, you can always very subtly give the odd sort of bleed here and there. And this is all experimental, you know, you're kind of finding your way, how much texture you want in your work, how much bleed you want in your work. Okay, and then finally I'm going to add some cute little sort of polka dotty things. Specks, I guess, is a better way of saying that. And I'm using, yeah, sort of a lighter brown. And coming back to my universal brush, I'm just simply randomly painting here and there. Probably should make this one a different direction. Doesn't really matter. Maybe some peeking in from the edges. Okay, so let's move on to some shadow work. So I suppose I should have shown you the original jug. I originally used a ceramic as a reference. It wasn't quite the same shape, but at least gave me some idea of the lighting. So if you can imagine, the lighting was coming more from the above, almost like to the side above. So it was creating shadows on the side, and it was of course creating the overall shadow of the jug to the left hand side. And that's kind of my loose line lighting, and I use that just to give my piece a little bit more of an elevation, more depth. And yeah, I really encourage you, if this is something that you want to get into, I encourage you to experiment with lighting, because it can be a really fun way to, you know, take your piece to the next level. So on the shadow layer, We're going to add detail in a second, but first I want to work on some shadow. So using a cool color, and I'm going to start with the shadow brush, and I'm going to work on detail first. So there will be probably shadow underneath the lip of this area, and there certainly will be shadow here, but I'm going to use a different brush for that because I want it to be quite strong, and just working on the more sort of detailed shadow areas. And you can decide how much you want to add. So each time I lift my pencil, I intensify the paint, and this is a nice way to quickly add more ink to an area. And then if you're finding it too harsh, you can blend it out like that. So you can imagine the bowl is coming round, so underneath is going to be in shadow. At this stage I'm kind of winging it, but I have an idea. So I want to intensify that, so I'm just going back over it. And we can always blend that area. So I prefer the subtlety that I have here. So I'm going to undo that and rather follow that as my guide. See, that's what happens when you don't have reference. And then just blend that out. And blend that out. So this is probably going to be the darkest area. So now I want to use the smudge wash to give an overall sort of shade on this side. Just want to check the size. So I'm working in circular motion because I want to blend that shadow as I work, and then just varying my brush size each time I need to. So this area will kind of have a bit more shadow. And then of course inside the jug. And if you're not feeling confident, or you feel like you've made a mistake, obviously undo what you don't like, or you can just go and smudge areas that may have too much paint. So I'm just going to blend there. Okay, so this is really coming together, and the last thing I want to do, I just want to do a bit of shadow underneath. So we can either use a stamp or we can use our brushes, and I'm actually going to use the smudge wash. But I'm working from the jug outwards because that's where the shadow will be darkest. And just coming back to smudge as I work. And then using the shadow brush just for some definition. I also prefer the hard edges of this brush, so that I'll use as my final kind of how do I say, you know, watercolor area. And for some interest, let's add a water splash. So again, using a light color, in this instance we could actually use white, and I'm just pushing, working in a sort of circular shape. And you, as I said, you can decide how much you want to add. I think what I want to do is I want to make the edges a little bit more pronounced. So that means a lot more pressure. And then using a smudge, I'm just going to pull some of this ink or paint. And we can even let it seep into the top area. Yeah, I think that's looking pretty good. And then finally, I want to add some detail. So this is generally my last layer that I work on. It's my defining layer, so I go over areas that I want the viewer's eyes to understand or see clearer. So in this instance, I want some edging over here. Maybe I want the handle to be a bit more obvious. Maybe I want to define this area as well. So going to my add detail layer, and I usually work on quite a dark brush. I often use a combination of either the rugged pencil or the detail water pencil. So I'm going to start with the rugged pencil for now. And even even if it's quite pencily, I sometimes use the one of the smudges just to smudge it here and there. And I'll show you what I mean. So I'm varying my pressure as I lay that down, and if I find it a little bit too hard, I just smudge that out and blend it in nicely. See, I quite like that grungy effect. It may not be your taste, but it definitely is sort of my style. And then what I do is, as I said, if I want to really accentuate an area so that underneath is quite important, this definition here. So I'm just adding a bit more sort of pencil work in a way, and then just blending as I work so it looks a little bit more, how do I say, watercolory. And I want to define the edge of the base a bit better and this curve. And we can swap to the detail watercolor brush. It's not as grungy, but just to show you that brush as well, I'm just going to blend those areas so they're not as pronounced. So this detail watercolor brush, the detail pencil, should I say, is great for, you know, fixing areas. Even if you know, I could go back to this handle layer using that blue and, you know, kind of fix it up, like blend it in as well. So it's almost like a, yeah, watercolor pencil. Again, this might be too contrasty for you, it might be too dark, but I'm hoping that by just showing you all these techniques, you can take what you need and use it in your own work, in your own style. And what I did was I'm just pulling that paint to blend it in. So I'm still in that detail area, and all I did was use that pencil, really dark, and now I'm just pulling it. So that's also a great way to apply some shadow work. So you'll see that's quite intense, and I'm just simply blending that better into the background. And what I want to do is I want to jump back to my rugged pencil and just add some defining areas here and there. So that the definition stage is definitely where it is personal preference. For me, I don't always like having line work everywhere, so it's just kind of here and there, and that's pretty much where I'm going to leave it now. So yeah, I think we're done. So I hope that gives you a good overview of the brushes and how you can incorporate them into your workflow to create more textured watercolor work. Hope you enjoyed that, and thanks for watching.